All right, hello everybody, welcome back. Okay, so basically we're just starting on the core book now. We're starting on material. Obviously it's going to be chapter 1 and we're talking about the origin of the idea of race and where it came from. This is going to feel a little bit like a history lesson in the beginning, but a lot of the historical context is relevant and necessary for a lot of what we'll talk about on the back end of that. So if you'll stick with me through the somewhat boring history lesson, it will all make sense and it will come together. What do I want to say here? Okay, so I'm basically going to be sending like week announcements or things that I need to either disclose to you via email in order to save time and be efficient in the things we want to cover and get to. And so just be sure to kind of regularly check your email in order to make sure that you're staying up to date on whatever announcements are posted. If there's some kind of information that you've missed or something like that, you know, it's entirely possible that I made mention of it in the announcement. So just keep that in mind. Anyway, we're going to jump into the topic of the origin of the idea of race. Let me get my clicker here. Okay, and so this is going to be kind of the format for the most part for how I do my lectures and how we move forward. As always, please, at any point that you have a question or you want to add a perspective or something like that, feel free to raise your hand and chime in, and I'd love to hear from you. But basically, I will always summarize what I do here. So basically, we're going to talk about or contextualize our discussion of the origins of the idea of race around human evolution. There are some important talking points to get to that we'll connect to on the back end. We'll also be working out to establish that the ancient Africans weren't just savages, sort of waiting to get civilized by Western European society, for example. I'll briefly update you again on where the first Americans were situated and all of that. And then we're going to talk about the logistical motives for why Europeans had a desire to expand outward across the globe, ultimately resulting in the colonization of the Americas. And then from there, we'll talk a little bit about how that then cultivated into the transatlantic slave trade, followed by a sort of colonial culture across the continent, and then the scientific racism that is informed a lot of the growth or expansion of that colonial culture, thereby leading to the culture of racism that we kind of know and are familiar with today in the American context, okay? Welcome, everybody. What I want to say here is that, yeah, this is how it's going to flow. It is entirely likely that we will not complete this entire lecture in just this particular period alone. So just keep that in mind. But on the back end, when we come back next week, we'll kind of wrap up with the discussion of where we left off here, and then go to the extended reading review. Okay. Okay, also what you should know is that at the beginning of the discussion of each chapter, chapter 1 and the key terms, these are the key terms that are listed in the back of your book, or not the back of your book, the back of the chapter, right? And some of these things I'm going to be touching on, but other things I might. You should also know that I may add some things, and I'll always create a space here where it's very clear what I'm adding that I want you to know beyond what the book does or doesn't talk about. I don't overload it too much, but because I like to add background information, there may be some additional information that you may be quizzed or examined on, and so you just want to kind of keep that in mind, that you want to review the lectures in addition to the reading. Yes?
Are we supposed to, like, on the online textbook, there's like the little quizzes? Are we like, I mean, like, I did it just because.
So sure, you're talking about the like multiple choice and you can click the bubbles kind of thing. No, you're not required to do those. I don't even think it connects to any kind of like point system. If it helps you to study, you're more than welcome to do that. But the questions the answers that I want you to submit are the critical thinking questions. For the first chapter in the assignment on Brightspace, you can see the list of questions that I put in the assignment bubble, the comment space there. Those are the questions that I'm looking for students to answer. Does that help?
Yeah.
All right, cool. All right, so let's get started. All right, we're going to dive deep here. The first thing we need to establish here in this discussion is seeing humans as a kind of primate in the context of being biological organisms. If you don't believe me, just kind of look at your hand, play around with your fingers, look at your fingernails, for example. Pay attention to the skeletal morphology here. And what you'll see is that it's very similar to what we're observing here, okay? Now, this has nothing to do with skin color. Again, I'm not saying monkeys somehow gave rise to black people and then black people spawned the rest of the human population for the racial context that we have here. But what you need to understand is that biologically, this is where humans fit in terms of the relationship to all life on Earth, okay? If you'll see here, you pay attention to the image of this chimpanzee hand, for example, and you don't even necessarily need to look at the palm, but perhaps the wrist. You will very clearly see that the skin color or the skin tone resembles that of what we would call fair skin or lighter skin, right? It turns out that the diversity of skin color variation that we observe across human beings, regardless of racial group, is really just a kind of primate skin color variation that has really no significant connection to the concept of race in the ways that we describe it, okay? This also then means that human beings are a kind of ape, not monkeys. Does everyone know the difference, or does anyone know the difference between monkeys and apes? Anyone? Yeah. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure the monkeys have prehensile tails.
Yes.
And then apes have like the, what do you call it, like the thumbs that they can use to.
Well, all primates
all of
have
them do?
opposable
Oh, okay,
thumbs.
got it.
Yeah, but you're close.
yeah.
Keep going.
Apes are more intelligent as well, and generally right than monkeys.
Sure. But I mean, like anatomically, what is the difference
Anatomically.
between monkeys and apes?
Oh, other than the prehensile tail thing, I don't know. I forgot.
Sure. Okay. So you can sit on the mic for now. Basically, the difference between apes and monkeys is that monkeys tend to be smaller bodied to medium bodied, and they have prehensile tails or non-prehensile tails. And then apes are medium bodied to large bodied, and they do not have tails at all. There are other characteristics that unify primates together aside from the opposable thumb, the ability to overextend the arms, for example, forward-facing eyes, enhanced vision, these kinds of things. But in general, human beings biologically are classified in this way. I'm gonna connect this to a significant talking point. Please don't just jump to getting offended just yet, right? It is that primates live in or thrive in very warm, humid climates that are generally closer to the equator. Okay, and this has some significant implications when we talk about the birthplace of humanity. Okay, so when you hear the phrase Africa is the birthplace of humanity, it's not that people are saying this just to try to make Africa like feel good about having significance in some global sense, but that this is a phrase that has literal scientific significance and biological significance. This is something that is significant on a species level, right? When you look at the birthplace of humanity in this context, we are talking about the literal origins from which human beings, including ourselves, anatomically emerge, okay? Where the earliest species of human to arise out of Africa was Homo habilis. Thousands of these fossils are generally found in this region of Africa through Turkana, Kenya, all the way down into South Africa. There's lots of bone fragments that are generally found. The bone fragments, the pelvis and the femur that you're seeing here are casts of the Lucy pelvis. Has everybody heard of Lucy? Anybody heard of Lucy? What do you know about Lucy? Can we pass the... Yeah, thank you.
This was from middle school, but I remember that I think it was like the oldest like complete kind of like skeletal remain of like a human, like humanoid sort of like human species. So yeah, I think it was like the oldest one we could find complete.
Sure. You don't have to pass it back, just put it down. Yeah, thank you. This is one of the first human species, and the reason why they classified it as human is particularly because of this pelvis. Anatomically, one of the things that makes human beings unique is that we're habitually bipedal, and you can see very close similarity both in the anatomy of the pelvis as well as the anatomy of the femur. But then more importantly, where you find other Homo habilis skulls, you'll see somewhat resemblance to some features that human beings display in their cranial morphology, although we are still significantly distinct. Homo habilis in general only stood at an adult individual is estimated to only have been about 3 feet to 3.5 feet or so. And generally you will find stone tools that they are using to butcher meat or cut meat in this regard. Does anyone know why the Lucy pelvis perhaps was named Lucy and was sexed to be a female individual? Can anyone take a guess? Why might that be? Can we pass the, is that okay? Yeah.
Is it because like the way that it's shaped is allowing like women to give birth and like only women can bear like a child?
So let's distinguish between women and female, but yes, the reason why it's sexed as female is because the cavity in the pelvis here is wide enough to accommodate childbirth. Right? And generally in male skeletal morphology, this pelvic cavity is not as wide. And so this is one of the reasons why anthropologists as well as paleontologists determine that perhaps this particular pelvis is one that belongs to a female. Right? And then as we move forward, there are lots of other extinct species of human fossils that have been found across the continent of Africa, but also proliferating across much of Europe, the Mediterranean, and then parts of Asia, right? And you can see here, for example, Homo rudolfensis, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo ergaster, for example. These are all casts, but recreations of fossils that are generally found and continue to be found in these particular regions. And they all display what we would now term to be ancestral morphological traits, right? Perhaps this heavy brow ridge here, a low forehead arch, for example, a really rounded mandible or a chin, for example. One of the near complete skeletons of Homo ergaster, for example, is found here. This is not classified as Homo sapiens, and I'll tell you the distinction in possibly on the next slide, I believe. But again, the significant point that I want to make here is that when you hear the phrase Africa is the birthplace of humanity, it has species level implications, and that's what this looks like, is the proliferation of human beings out of the continent of Africa. It wasn't just Homo sapiens, it was other extinct species of humans whose fossil remains are continue to be found today. This is one of the near complete skeletons of a Homo ergaster individual. Osteologists estimate that this individual died around the age of 15 years old, for example. Obviously, it's classified as Homo ergaster, particularly because it looks very ancient, and morphologically speaking, this is not closely resembling anatomically modern human beings. But you still have lots of significant resemblance here in the rib cage, the pelvis, for example, the femur or the legs, right? This is what's called the Turkana boy. This is sexed to be a male individual. Can anyone guess why?
Skinnier pelvis?
Yeah, a smaller pelvic cavity, right? That clearly suggests that this individual may have been male, right? One of the only distinguishing features between anatomically modern humans, or what we call Homo sapiens, and other extinct species of humans is actually just one specific feature found on the skull, and that's called the mandibular protuberance. If you take your index finger, for example, and just kind of tuck it under your teeth, and kind of circle it around a little bit, you'll feel a little divot. This is the thing you call a chin. For some reason, our species is the only human species that displays this unique feature, whereas all other extinct species of humans do not have that feature at all, right? Now, here's the interesting part. This heavy brow ridge, you could call it the caveman brow ridge, for example, and this low forehead arch, these are features that are still displayed in anatomically modern human beings today. I want to show you an example of it really quickly. It's really interesting, but not all human beings have that sort of small or lighter brow ridge followed by a kind of high forehead arch, and I'll show you that in a second. Here, check this out. Let me pull up Google Chrome. There we go. So this is a Russian boxer and politician. His name is Nikolai Valuev. I'm trying to pull up a nice little image here where you can see this, right? He has a very heavy brow ridge, right? Followed by that kind of low forehead arch, a feature that if you compare to this image of him fighting Evander Holyfield, you can clearly see that he retains some of those, what we would term ancestral features that are found in these other extinct species. We still classify him as Homo sapiens though, because he has that chin. It's just that this is a retained trait. It's a retained feature that you can see here. And so when I go back to the image of this Homo ergaster skull, you can very much clearly see that that's what his skull kind of looks like, right? Again, it's that when we talk about the birthplace of humanity, we're not just talking about these human beings, but we're talking about all human beings, where they came from as biological organisms, and race has nothing to do with that. Skin color has nothing to do with that, and this is what that means. And as we move forward, that carries significance because when we talk about the history of the people that populated much of the northern region or northern western region of Africa, we're talking about a people who were not just bushmen sitting in, just random people, savages sitting in bushes, picking their noses and waiting for the white man to come and civilize them. The people who inhabited these regions, anatomically modern humans, were people who had significant historical legacies, wealth, influence. They had spirituality and academics. They had a long-standing history for thousands of years that predates ultimately their descendants being stolen from these regions. Now, what happens in, let's say, modern times is that lots of African Americans, for example, will often point to Egypt as a place of an example of the civility of Africa in ancient times, and to combat this idea that Black people were in fact civilized and concentrated knowledge. And although Egypt was in fact ancient civilization that concentrated knowledge and spirituality and all kinds of civilized sophistication, most of the descendants of the people who were enslaved in the Americas did not actually come from Egypt. They came from the regions of West Africa. This is where they were stolen from. So we're talking about Ghana, we're talking about Mali, perhaps Senegal, for example. All of those people existed in these regions, right? And even as they existed there, they had empires. They weren't just entirely, of course, there were tribes and tribal-like people who inhabited these regions, but much of the empire of Ghana, for example, the empire of Mali, they had complex trade routes, they had relationships or trade relationships with Egypt, they had ongoing trade relationships with Europeans, the Portuguese, for example, the Spanish. And they would trade in lots of things. They would trade in salt, in peppers, in gold, in slaves, for example. And the Empire of Mali is one of the significant empires of this region through historical times because they're one of the richest to have ever existed in the world. And I'll talk to you about that in a moment. But the history of West Africa covers what is generally termed to be the three great Sudanese empires. Okay, the Empire of Ghana, the Empire of Mali, and I am absolutely blanking on the third name, but I teach about this in another class. You'll have to forgive me. And so I just want to give you an example for an example. The Empire of Mali, right, existed between 1230 and 1468, and it was one of the central located cities for Islamic learning. Okay, they had systems of trade, they had wealth, they had incredibly powerful armies. Okay, one of the most prominent leaders of the Empire of Mali was a man named Mansa Musa. Has anyone heard of Mansa Musa? Yeah, a few of you. Somebody who hasn't spoken yet, could you please share with us what you know about Mansa Musa? Sure. Remind me your name.
So I don't know all like the specific details, but I feel like I heard he was like the richest man in history.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The richest man in history, in part because, let's say, if Africa is the birthplace of humanity, and we're talking about the development of civilization through, let's say, some sort of evolutionary time, Africa had a leg up. Right? And so at some point, by concentrating these empires, by concentrating these armies, and forming these complex trade relationships, the Empire of Mali is one of those significant empires that's going to build a great amount of wealth. Right? And so yes, Mansa Musa was one of the richest, wealthiest men to have ever lived in history, literally, but also significant for the region that he and his empire occupied. Okay. Now, as I've said, in the Empire of Mali, they had significant trade in slaves, in gold, in peppers, in salt. They would receive resources and valuables from Egypt, from Greece, from the Portuguese. They would trade slaves. And they had large economies that allowed them to build and sustain the wealth that they had. These are not people who are just savages of the bush picking their noses, okay? It just so happens to be that their descendants, through a series of unfortunate circumstances, became vulnerable, and I'll explain that in a moment. But before I do, I want to show you an example of the significance of their economic power as well as their political power, is that the Empire of Mali largely inhabited much of this region of West Africa. And the region I'm pointing to for the camera, because you can't see the laser, is this region around Nyana all the way through to Timbuktu and Atagost, okay? And so they were, as a center for Islamic learning of their time, for example, obviously they were Islamic, they were Arabic, so they would yearly pilgrimage to Mecca, right, as is Islamic tradition, but they would do so on foot. And the reason for that is because, you know, planes didn't exist, cars didn't exist. And by on foot, I do mean like perhaps riding a camelback or a horseback or something like that, right? But they would travel across the entire Sahara Desert and then cross through Cairo in order to then go down Jeddah and get to Mecca here. And they would sustain populations, I believe, of up to 60 million. To and from Mecca. That takes an incredible amount of power and resource and knowledge and navigation and sophisticated knowledge to be able to do something like that, okay? So no, perhaps some of the descendants of the empires of Mali may have traveled to Egypt and lived in Egypt and, you know, created families, and perhaps some Egyptians traveled to Mali and laid their laid their roots there or something like that. But in general, when we're talking about the origins of the people who were ultimately stolen, we're not talking about people that come from Egypt. We're talking about these people over here who were still highly sophisticated, incredibly wealthy, incredibly powerful for a number of reasons. But because this is a class on race in contemporary society, one of the significant things that I want to tell you about is their system of slavery. The first thing you need to know is that slavery was not necessarily a permanent condition like it was in the US. During these particular times, the conditions of slavery may have varied depending on location. Okay, there was no empire that ever existed in the world, whether that is, we're talking about some Chinese empire or Korean empire or somewhere in Europe or the Mediterranean or even in Africa. There is no empire that has ever existed without slave labor. Okay, in order to be taken seriously as an empire, in essence, during this particular time, they had to have their hand in human trafficking in some kind of way. There was just no way you could demonstrate your power as an empire to others if you could not exploit human labor and remove people from their autonomy and their freedom, right? So in this context then, slavery was a fundamental part of just the culture of the time, not just for the Empire of Mali, but for Greece, for Rome, okay? And it wasn't based on skin color. Now, yes, because the Empire of Mali is enslaving people and then selling these slaves, yes, there were black people who were enslaved, but in the Kingdom of Rome, there were white people who were enslaved, or what we now call today white people who were enslaved. Slavery was not something that was just a marker or a designation of one's skin color or their capabilities therein, okay? Now, depending on the context in which a person was enslaved, it's entirely possible that if you were a slave to royalty, you probably had some political or even economic power, even as a slave. You could probably own property. You could probably have some autonomy that other lower status slaves could not have or could not exercise, right? So it largely depended on the circumstance in which a person was enslaved. Most people who were enslaved during these particular times would find the ability to be able to work towards their freedom in a way. Right? And the conditions for their freedom were absolutely arbitrary. Perhaps in one society there were laws that dictated the conditions of freedom, but in another society it was completely different. But in a way, having slaves was like assimilating to the surrounding culture. No one would take you seriously if you didn't have a kind of slave economy of some kind. Okay? So slavery was not invented with the discovery of the Americas. Slavery existed for tens of thousands of years before the Americas were so-called quote-unquote discovered. And that's something that's important that you need to know, okay? Are there any questions about this? No? Okay. Can I move forward? I see people taking notes. Okay. Now hold on to that knowledge for a second. I'm kind of throwing a few different pages at you, but this is all going to come together in toward the back end of this, and you'll see how, I promise. Just a reminder, I showed you this map last week of the proliferation of humanity across the globe and the ways in which scientists have synthesized their knowledge in order to understand how human racial diversity likely came about, but then also how these people came to inhabit the globe, right? And so just a reminder that there were lots of people who likely crossed an ice bridge or a land bridge of some kind that connected Asia to Alaska some 15 to 20,000 years ago, and then their descendants began to inhabit much of North and South America. This is termed the pre-Columbian period, and the reason why it's termed the pre-Columbian period is because this is the period before Columbus discovered the Americas, right? So for up to 20,000 years or so, and I'm just kind of giving a little bit of wiggle room there, up to 20,000 years or so ago, these people lived in relative isolation, right? Now, what I mean by that is isolated from the old world, isolated from the ways of the old world, the norms of the old world, okay? There was just no cross-pollination here that allowed for knowledge that this entire, or these two continents of land ever even existed, right? Now, I am reminding you because throughout the lecture slides, you may see the term First Americans. I'm reminding you that that is language that I am using. And the reason why I am using First Americans to describe these people is particularly because they were here first, right? And their descendants, okay? So keep that in mind. Now, in what we call the continental United States, okay? These are the tribes that are understood to have existed up to 1492. Okay, this does not say that tribes didn't exist in Canada or didn't exist in Mexico or something like that. Of course they did. But in the continental United States, these are some of the tribes that have been wiped out, have been displaced. Some of their descendants still exist today, but this is what they look like. So for example, you might be familiar with the Cherokee or the Osage, for example, or the Crow. These are all different tribes that were able to survive the legacy of colonization and displacement. But a lot of these other ones have been completely eradicated. Also, what's interesting to note is that there are a lot of states names, the names of states in this country that are named directly after the tribes that inhabited those regions. So for example, you could see here the Missouri tribe, right, is where we get the name Missouri. The Alabamaha tribe is where we get the name Alabama, for example. Let's see, you have the Iowa tribe is where we get the name Iowa. You see lots of examples there. I don't need to go through all of them, but Dakota, for example. You can see where we get the Dakotas. These are the tribes that existed, and this is what their inhabitants of the continental United States looked like before European settlers ever even arrived on the eastern seaboard. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, what were the motives for why Europeans even wanted to expand in the first place? Right? Because they have their own countries, they have their own empires, they have their own kingdoms. And in general, it's what I would term or condense down into the 3 Gs. You have glory, gold, and God. Okay? Now, each of these 3 Gs is not necessarily a unique motive for Europe alone. Okay, there were lots of kingdoms, Islamic kingdoms, Mediterranean kingdoms. All of these kingdoms kind of more or less had the same goals in mind when I describe these things. But because we're talking about this in connection to colonization, I am therefore talking about it in the context of Europe. Okay, now the first G that I describe here, glory, really just pertains to political power, right? That every empire in the old world was competing to try to become the dominant world power over other empires, and to make sure that those empires could recognize them as the dominant force. And maybe exerting their domination occurred through wealth, or the accumulation of wealth, perhaps the annexation or the acquisition of land. Perhaps it was something about just becoming a world power and forcing others to recognize that this empire is not to be messed with. Okay, gold here describes the economic motive, that if you can get access to resources, perhaps unique access to resources, perhaps you're the only one that can produce a unique kind of resource, you can generate wealth through trade, right? That then allows you to sort of build a kind of economic power that then helps you to facilitate the accumulation of political power. Right? So yes, of course they want to have trade relationships with other kingdoms, but they're also competing for unique access to those resources and perhaps control over those resources. So many of the Europeans, for example, had direct connections to African luxury goods, to Asian luxury goods. And during this particular time, there wasn't necessarily the rhetoric that by virtue of the African people being black, they're somehow anthropologically inferior. Right? It was just that there is the pursuit for economic power, there is the pursuit for political power, and then God, the last G, the pursuit for religious power. Right? This idea that one's religious philosophy or religious orientation is the way to be. Right? Our God is the one true God, and the heathens on those in that other empire, they're the ones that need to yield, they need to convert, and they need to plead for salvation. That kind of thing. Right? Has anyone here played Civilization, like Civ 5, Civ 6? Are you familiar with it at all? No? Perhaps the game of Risk? You know, global domination. No one's played Risk in there? Oh, wow. All right. The point is that these examples that I'm mentioning here, they're games in which the strategy is to try to create a kingdom that then allows you to dominate the world. And there are multiple ways that you can do it. You can do it economically, you can do it through research, you can do it through religion, and then whichever way you try to build your influence in the world, other countries develop those competitors against you, and you kind of have to battle against them. And so the point is that there's going to be all kinds of motives for European expansion: political motives, economic motives, religious motives, and the interplay of all of those things will work to create the kind of cultures of combat, the cultures of warfare, the cultures of conflict that we often observe in the historical context. So an example of this is like the Crusades in 1096 and 1291, for example, where the Catholic Church is organizing a series of military campaigns where they want to go and occupy different regions, take over different kingdoms, and then absorb their resources, and then convert the inhabitants of those kingdoms to their faith, to their religion, right? Now, the Crusades ultimately failed. It didn't work, but it did increase European awareness in the old world, and it did help them to accelerate their economic change in such a way that it would help them to build and sustain the resources needed to, say, travel across the Atlantic Ocean and then accidentally end up in a new land. Okay, so it was things like this, for example, that because there is the motive to fight those heathen Muslims over there, or to dominate that empire and take all of their resources, absorb all of their gold, and then work it into the economy and work it into their own systems of trade, they're able to build and accelerate their economic change that ultimately gives them more political power, geopolitical power, and influence over competitor rivals. Okay. By the time we get to the Renaissance era, we're talking about the 1300s to the 1600s here, we enter a period in which most human populations, not just Europe, but Europe in particular, because I'm talking about the colonization, Europe is trying to transition from this sort of Game of Thrones era of like medieval living or Middle Ages into a sort of state or an age of modernity. And that state or age of modernity is one in which they're trying to unite or utilize knowledge in order to strategize for developing faster or more efficient trade routes, to advance their war tactics, to perhaps just improve their relationships with others or even their domination over other groups. And because they're concentrating knowledge from Muslim philosophy, from Greek philosophy, from Roman philosophy, a natural consequence of this was that they began to ponder about the nature of being human. What does it mean to be human? What is humanity's place in the world? And what is the way that God ordains it? Why is it that there are certain kingdoms or groups that seem to appear to dominate others? Is that the natural order of things? Is this the way that God wants it? Is this the way that God wills it? They began to ponder about lots of these ideas that would ultimately sow the seeds for the culture of racism that we currently have today. Okay. So where Europe has a desire to expand, you can see here on this slide, these red lines across the old world, for example. These are all trade routes that you can see here. We could say, for example, that the Portuguese and the Spanish wanted to travel to India in order to get access to spices and cotton and precious stones and sugar, for example. Perhaps in order to get silk and drugs and porcelain, you had to travel to China, but you could see that it would take a very long time in order to travel these great distances to do so, right? Now, if you can imagine that there are ongoing conflicts, perhaps the Christians are at battle with the Muslims and there's this religious warfare going on, but if you have to sail in a boat around the entire continent of Africa, as you can see here, not only is it exhausting, but there's the possibility that if you're that ship that happens to dock is somewhere where it's not safe, and by virtue of your skin color, you clearly stand out as an outsider, you might lose your resources. You might lose your control over the things you just acquired or spent time traveling to acquire, right? So the idea here was that perhaps the Europeans could avoid even going to the continent of Africa where there's these ongoing religious conflicts. They don't want to get robbed or they don't want their ships to get pillaged. If they just kind of sail westward and then end up somewhere over here and they can figure out how to get to India, right? So they already knew that the world was round. They didn't know there was an entire other two continents, but this is one of the maps that they would use to navigate. Can somebody guess, for example, this lower left-hand corner here, what this region would represent on this map? Yeah, Africa, which would make this, and then right, okay. So they know, for example, that like, okay, we're up here somewhere in Europe and like, it's kind of dangerous if we have to travel through these crevices because we're vulnerable to being pillaged if we end up in the middle of a religious conflict. And we're not a part of this religious conflict. We don't want to be. But what if we just kind of sail westward? If we just sailed westward, we're not going to fall off the edge of the earth or anything. We'll probably just come back around over here and then we can figure out how to get to India, right? So that's what happened, right? Christopher Columbus, a bunch of other people in 1492 figured, okay, we know the earth is round. Perhaps we can establish a quicker trade route. We have navigation to guide us. Maybe we could just sail westward and then end up somewhere eastward, and we can completely avoid the ongoing religious conflicts altogether. So what they did was, they didn't necessarily sail directly west. It was more like southwestward. But in sailing southwestward, right, the idea is that if you go down in this direction, you'll probably end up somewhere over here, and then you can just kind of figure out how to wiggle your way into India that way, okay? But what happened? When they did this, what happened?
Roadblock.
What was the roadblock?
America.
Right, the Americas. Okay. Now, in this slide, take it with a grain of salt because of the context in which I'm speaking. It wasn't that everybody just showed up at once. Okay. It was literally that you just sailed southwestward and they ended up in what we now call the West Indies. Okay. The West Indies is kind of a little bit off of the picture here, but over in this area in the Caribbean. Why do they call it the West Indies? Anyone know? Anyone want to take a guess? Yeah, can I get the mic over here? Actually, can tell me your name? Catherine. Can I get Catherine first and then, yeah.
Maybe because they thought they were in West India.
Yeah, they were like, well, we're going to India. We're going to hit India at some time. And then they end up hitting an island with these indigenous natives. Feel free to put it down. These indigenous natives that they've never seen before, and they're like, are these Indians the Indians we're looking for? Maybe there's like a different part of India, and like these Indians are not the Indians we want, but hey, maybe they can tell us where the Indians are, right? So they encounter them that way. Did you want to add to that? Yeah, okay. So essentially, that's just kind of how it happened. And it wasn't necessarily that everybody showed up at once. It was actually the Portuguese and the Spanish first. But that's ultimately what happened, right? And so then in this next slide, right, immediately, it's not like immediately they just show up and they're like, oh, we're going to destroy everything, we're going to kill these people, and we're going to take their stuff. Like, that wasn't what happened. There was an ongoing relationship with the natives. If you met a completely different kind of human being that you've never seen before, is your first inclination going to be to attack them? No. Right? They speak a different language, they're in a foreign land, they look different, they dress different. You're gonna wanna kind of figure out, like, who are they? Where did they come from? How long have they been there? How can you build a bridge of mutual connection so that you can learn their language, they can learn your language, and you can figure out how to communicate so you can ask them, are you the Indians we're looking for? I don't think so, right? But ultimately what happens is, in learning about these people, they realize, first of all, these people don't have armor. They don't have the sophisticated kinds of weaponry that the Europeans have, because the people that inhabit the North and South America here, they don't have the history of like thousands of years of conflict, thousands of years of infighting, and no, that's not to say that they're just sitting there together singing Kumbaya every day. Yes, by virtue of being human, they have conflict, but they didn't necessarily have the sort of like culture of warfare and domination and annexation and power grabbing that was going on in the old world. So what happens is these native people, they just exist. And after, let's say, a few years or so, the Europeans realize, hey, like, these people, they're like really nice. They don't have any of the technology we have. And like, there's just all this land here. We could probably just like take their shit. We could just take it. And they're like really nice. Like, they can't even do anything. Even if they tried to fight us, we can overpower them. So it quickly became a thing where the Portuguese go back to their Christian counterparts, the Spanish, the Dutch, the English. They're telling these people, hey, like, we found this other like territory over here, and the Muslims don't know about it. Maybe we could just kind of go and grab like as much of this land as possible for ourselves, and then like try to build our own resources or get access to unique resources that we can then ship back to Europe, and then we'll build our wealth that way, and no one would be the wiser. And that was the idea. So the entire country, not the entire country of Spain, but Spain, if you think about the country or the size of Spain relative to the Spanish-speaking countries that we know of that exist here, Spain was like immediately like, it just spread itself thin, right? So if you think about the size of the country of Spain, and then you think about Spain trying to grab this orange area on this on the left map here, and then much of the purple and the green, they're just trying to get as much of that land as possible. And it doesn't matter that they can't control every corner of it, but they're trying to lay claim to it. So that it's theirs, and everybody knows it's theirs. The French come in from this northern region here and then start grabbing what we now call Canada, and then eventually this region of Louisiana here, right? The British settlements over here were much, much smaller. But the point is, they're coming in and they're like disregarding the humanity of the people that currently inhabit. They don't care that these people occupy these regions. They don't care about anything other than just controlling the land. And obviously, because they can't just eradicate every single person that exists there, the idea is they're bringing that religious conversion inertia with them, that inertia of like religious war, where you can go, maybe you can convert them, save their souls from damnation, and then by virtue of converting them, they just kind of yield to control and our power, and then we submit. And there were genuinely missions and churches that truly believed that. When you look at this image over here on the left and you see the dots with the crosses, these are all missions that were erected in the region that Spain inhabited, right? The little X-shaped boxes that you see here, these are forts of the French trying to come in and control the land and keep the Spanish out and keep the British out and make sure they know this is our land, right? And essentially now these European countries are like competing for control of as much as they can just lay claim to, right? And a lot of them are spreading themselves way too thin. They're just, gotta get as much as I can right now, gotta get as much, grab anything, grab everything. And so this is what that looked like, okay? So the Portuguese were the first to do this, right? And as I already said, because I tend to talk ahead of myself, it initially started off with cultural greetings and exchanges. It wasn't just an immediate power grab, but it slowly became that way when they realized that these people dress naked, they don't have sophisticated weaponry, they're a little bit barbaric according to the Europeans, right? But because these people are seeing new human beings that they've never seen before, never even knew existed, during this period, there were already philosophical debates and conversations around the nature of humanity, and this just added to it. Because now we have new human beings we've never seen before, and we're already pondering humanity's place in the world, in the natural world, in the ways that God ordains it. And then wait, what's going on with these human beings over here? There's like these new human beings we don't even know about. Okay, what is humanity's place in the world really now? Because look, right? And so what happens is in the Catholic Church during this age of discovery, you have Pope Paul IV in 1537 who is hearing about the discovery of these new red people and sees them as humans, and he recognizes their humanity, and he's advocating for what we would then term monogenism. And this was the idea that because they are human, they must come from God, and that must mean that we share a common ancestor. This was what Pope Paul IV was saying. We share a common ancestor, and that ancestor is God, and the reason is because we are made in his image, right? So this is what the Pope was saying, but a lot of people were offended by that idea. Why would they be offended by that? Use your racism, it's okay. Yeah, I saw two hands at once, but you already have the mic, so.
Because maybe they wouldn't want to be identifying with like a lesser society in their...
Perhaps, yeah.
I think because a lot of them wanted to enslave indigenous people from the get-go, or not, like, honestly, from the get-go, and they didn't like anybody getting in the way of that.
Yeah, so it wasn't necessarily that they wanted to enslave the indigenous people from the get-go, but I'll kind of build off of what both of you were saying, you're kind of right, was that there was absolutely no way that my God looks as ugly as that. My God can't possibly look like that. And I'm insulted that the Pope of all people, would even remotely have the audacity to suggest that my pious, great, omnipotent, beautiful God could somehow reflect the ugliness and barbaric cultures of these savage people. Yeah.
I'm not saying you're wrong, but I just, to me, that seems like almost like a weird explanation, because I feel like at the time, like if you read like the accounts of the people who, like the Europeans who came to the Americas, a lot of them didn't necessarily see the indigenous people as ugly.
No.
I feel like it's more about opportunism than ingrained hatred. Like there was an opportunity. You know what I'm saying?
Sure. So then you would have to explain where the emergence of polygenism came from. Where did polygenism come from, right? Polygenism was this counter idea to the Pope that, no, okay, maybe they're human, but we don't share a common ancestor, and there's no way that my God looks like that. Perhaps they have some kind of different origins, because ultimately polygenism feeds into the establishment of scientific racism. So if what you're saying is true, and again, I'm not trying to dismiss you either, but if what you're saying is true, then the onus would be on you to explain the origins of polygenism. Sure.
I mean, I feel like this question is interesting because it's kind of like the chicken versus the egg almost type thing.
Sure.
But I kind of, so if you're saying like we have to like explain polygenism, I just don't know like what's the certain point where Europeans start saying, oh, it's because you're inherently lesser, or like you're not really human, versus like the cultural.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of hard to pinpoint in my view on things, is that I feel like that comes from an opportunistic desire to take advantage, and then the polygenism comes later as an explanation for that.
We're literally about to talk about that right now, or in a few slides.
Gotcha.
But yes, we're literally getting to where that even came from. But you might entirely be right. Like neither of us existed there, so how could I have the absolute answer on this? It's entirely possible that it could be a chicken and egg scenario. But after I explain this to you, perhaps it might be a bit clearer. Let's get there. Okay. Okay, so again, during the time around the 17th century, right, there are these philosophical debates and conversations about the nature of humanity, the origins of humanity, and what would give rise to early anthropological thought or thinking. And they didn't call it anthropology at the time, that language didn't exist, but obviously there were people that were devoting a lot of their time to understanding humanity and understanding the ways that God has ordained human beings to organize in the natural world. And so because a lot of the scientific knowledge was coming from Europe at the time, of course, Europe is the one, or Europeans were the ones to have, quote unquote, discovered these new people, they weren't necessarily controlling for cultural difference. Right? So in essence, the kind of inception of this thinking was that Europe is kind of the default center, right? And you look at European culture as the default center from which there are clear deviations and differences. And we can then view those deviations and differences as being abnormal, right? To some degree, greater or lesser, doesn't really matter. But then this narrative began to center Europe as like the apex of civilization and the foundation of human achievement. And what happened was, because these are scientists that are opining on the nature of humanity, philosophers that are opining on the nature of humanity, they begin to build scientific language around their assessments of these different people and these different cultures. And ultimately, they believe that if this is the natural order of things, it is very clear that by virtue of Europe being technologically advanced, clearly more sovereign and civilized. Look at how Europeans dress themselves in comparison to these natives, right? That Europe must be the stronger kind of human and therefore the better kind of human. And in this way, they began to look at these human beings as, yes, perhaps they are a kind of human, but they must be lesser evolved, because when we compare them to European standards of culture and society, there are clear and visible differences that allude to their sophistication. Okay. And so then these philosophical ponderings then begin to fuel a reason to justify even dominating these people in the first place. And so the idea became, well, we want to build a kingdom, we want to build empires, we want to control resources and access to those resources and be able to ship those things back over to Europe. And so in order to build that empire, we have to do what all empires do, is enslave people. And so they immediately began trying to enslave the natives. Okay? It didn't start with enslaving Africans. It was literally, let's just try to enslave the natives and let's see how far we can get with that. Okay, and so ultimately this was not a good idea. The natives were not great candidates for enslavement, and that's particularly because they were never really exposed to Europe or Europeans before, so they were dying of lots of diseases that they had no exposure to in recent history, or relative recent history, right? Okay. Then in addition to that, because this is a power play, it's a power grab, they're asserting power and force over these people. Imagine for a moment, tell me your name. Imagine a big hulking guy with armor comes into the classroom right now, grabs Jordan by her hair and throws her on the ground. Are some people going to come to her defense? I would hope so. Right? Maybe some people are going to get scared and run, but there might be other people like, no, we need to stop. We need to fight. We need to, right? We need to fight back. We need to retaliate. And ultimately that is what's happening here, is that even though the natives are not necessarily as tactically advantaged as the Europeans are, that doesn't necessarily stop them from trying to fight back. So this created ongoing lethal combat, lethal warfare, and these people are dying. They're dying of genocide, they're dying of diseases. Some of them were successfully enslaved. That much is true. But then even those natives that were successfully enslaved had a very easy time fleeing and getting away because they knew the terrain. They're familiar with the terrain. They can navigate, they can navigate the terrain and the landscape better than the Europeans can. It's like trying to enslave somebody in their own backyard. Like, how do you do that, right? Has anyone seen Home Alone? Right? Where it's like, these robbers come in and they're trying to get this kid, but the kid has all these booby traps that they don't know about, right? It's kind of like that. I'm not saying they have booby traps like Indiana Jones, but what I'm saying is they're more familiar with the landscape than these invaders are, so it gives them the advantage of at least getting away. They can't necessarily dominate them and fight them off, but they're not really ideal candidates for enslavement, right? And so then who would be the next ideal people for enslavement? Yeah.
Africans.
Africans, and why?
Well, I'm pretty sure like at this point the Portuguese had already like made contact like with West Africa in like the late 1400s, and there was already established contact between Europe and Africa.
Literally.
Also, Africa had a pretty long history of slavery, so a lot of like, especially in West Africa, a lot of the societies, they already had people from like other regions that were being enslaved, so they could just come and say like, hey, like, can you sell us some of your slaves? And they were like, yeah, good deal.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so it just so happened to be that the fallen empire of Mali, the Songhai Empire, that was the name that I had forgotten earlier, the people of these empires, their leaders had died, had fallen, and it created political instability that ultimately left these people vulnerable to their own systems of slavery that they created. So without a sort of pioneer or a leader to concentrate forces and strategize about how to fend off invaders, these people were essentially ripe for the picking. So the Portuguese would in fact come in to the familiar people and faces that they knew and said, hey, we need slaves. We need as many slaves as we can possibly get. Don't worry about what it's for. Don't worry about it. But we'll give you rum, we'll give you guns, we'll give you gunpowder, we'll give you whatever you need. Like, we can trade, this will be a trade, but try to round up as many slaves as you can. And so ultimately the Africans were there. Before we get to a discussion about African enslavement, it wasn't just the Portuguese that were laying conquest to these lands. The Spanish came in and already knew what was up. And at this particular point, they were just like, look, we're here to take your land and we're taking as much as possible. And they're bringing with them that religious inertia, that religious fervor. And in the context of this, it was convert or die. Yield or die. but we're not playing any games and we're not giving up our acquisition of this land. So you only have two options. You can either join us through subservience or you're going to lose your life. Okay, so they're erecting crosses, they're asserting themselves as a dominant force. That leads to more infighting and conflict. And again, because these Spanish conquistadors are coming from thousands of years long history of normalized fighting and warfare, they are easily able to dominate these other lesser technologically developed people. That doesn't mean that these people were like savages at all. They still had their own spiritualities. They had their own systems of academia. The Mayans, for example, were adept in astronomy. They had their own astronomical systems. They were adept in mathematics. But a lot of that knowledge was lost because their libraries were burned down. A lot of their buildings were destroyed. A lot of the wise elders were killed off. It just created a hostile environment in which they were unable to resist the forceful influence and invasion of the Spanish conquistadors. I'll give you an example of this. This is the Guadalajara Cathedral. This is one of the oldest Catholic missions and cathedrals to exist in Mexico. It was built in 1541, for example. This is what it looks like. On its own, I must admit, it is a very beautiful building, but its history of where it originates from is very dark. That's what that looks like, and that's one of the oldest missions in Mexico. Does anyone know Our Lady of Guadalupe? Have you seen this imagery before? What do you know about, do you know anything about Our Lady of Guadalupe?
I mean, I don't actually know a lot just because my family's not Catholic.
Sure.
So I just know that like it's a really prominent image in like, especially like Mexican Catholicism.
Yeah.
It's kind of, yeah, it's like.
Yeah, a lot of Mexicans are devoutly Catholic. And I'll kind of explain why in a moment. Does anyone know where Our Lady of Guadalupe comes from or the story? Yeah.
Yeah, so
you have the,
yeah. I guess I don't remember every detail of the story, but it was basically there's like an indigenous Mexican, and by some sort of miracle, the Virgin of Lady of Guadalupe like appears to him like in a vision, and then he goes and like tells everybody, and then it kind of like legitimized Catholicism for the indigenous people and allowed the Catholics to like convert them more easily.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Let me pull this up. You are very knowledgeable. Let me pull this up really quick. Sorry for the caps lock. Let's see here. Just Wikipedia. I want to read a paragraph to you. Check this out. This one here. According to the Nikan Mopohua, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that, included in the 17th century I can't pronounce that, sorry. Written in Nahuatl, the Virgin Mary appeared 4 times to Juan Diego, a Chichimec peasant, and once to his uncle Juan Bernardino. The first apparition occurred on the morning of Saturday, December 9th, 1531, which is December 19th on the Gregorian calendar. Juan Diego experienced a vision of a young woman at the place called the Hill of Tepeyac, which later became the Villa de Guadalupe in a suburb city of Mexico. Pay attention to the date, 1531 here. What's the context in 1531? Yeah.
This was about 10 years after the conquest of Mexico City.
But not even after, it's just ongoing.
Oh, true. Well, I mean, like their leader had technically fallen at that point, but they were, they were still,
So then we're talking about people who prior to this invasion had absolutely no knowledge of Catholicism whatsoever, are suddenly having visions and are going, hey, I had a vision. I believe. I'm a believer. I'm converted. What does that sound like? Be real. What does it sound like? Trauma. Yeah. Like coercion. Like it's like you're watching the people around you get slaughtered, and the only thing that appears to save you from getting killed by these people who are clearly more powerful than you are is to just go, look, I'm a believer. I converted. Hey, I had a vision 4 times. I'm going to tell all my people. They're going to believe me. We're going to convert. And then that's just how it's going to be. And then it legitimizes the faith. It legitimizes the church. And this is one of the reasons, not the reason, but one of the reasons why the people who inhabit this region are so devoutly Catholic even today. Now, today, it's become a culture norm. Nobody's going, oh my God, if I'm not Catholic, the Spanish is going to kill me, and da-da-da-da. But during that time, that inertia of trauma is what ultimately normalizes the proliferation of Catholicism across this region. Isn't that interesting? Please don't let me say this as a way to challenge your faith or challenge your belief or anything like that. But I mean, at some level, we got to be real. Like, the origins of religion are not all just sunshine and rainbows, and this is one of those ugly moments. Okay, and then the French are more or less, the same. They come into Quebec, Montreal, and they inhabit what would become to be Canada. Eventually, they wanted to control the St. Lawrence River because it connects the region that we now call Canada through much of what they once called Louisiana. And it allowed them to access or control how they shipped resources from the continent of North America and then shipped it out back into France, right? At the time, they were mainly interested in fur trade because there were lots of animals in this particular region that did not exist in the old world. And if they could harvest those furs and then bring those furs back to Europe, they could sell those unique furs as a unique kind of monopoly or monopolized access. But don't let these pictures fool you. The French were very much still just as aggressive as the Spanish and as the Portuguese. Okay, I'm not going to talk about Courrier de Bois at all, but yeah, the point is the French are exactly the same, right? So where we already just established that the Africans were these ideal candidates for enslavement, where the natives weren't, it is largely for the reasons that you said. They already have ongoing relationships with the Europeans, so they're not immune to disease, but they're resistant to those diseases. If you take and enslave Africans and then you take them into a foreign land, those Africans are in part going to be dependent on their enslavers for survival because they don't know how to survive in the natural wilds of this new environment, right? And then to some extent, it wasn't necessarily that they're enslaving these Africans because they're black. It just so happened to be that if you're looking for the manpower and the exploitation of human labor, you just want as many bodies as you can. So you're going to your friendly neighborhood slave dealers to go and figure out how you can get more slaves. And so because they lost their kingdom, they lost their leadership, they still need some kind of economy. If you go to those skilled slave catchers, and you tell them, hey, look, get me as many as you can. I'll give you what you need. You'll have muskets, you'll have gunpowder. Go use those things. Get me this, and we're golden. And then that's what they go do, right? So, the Portuguese were the first to establish a system of going into West Africa, making a deal with slave catchers, and then rounding up lots of bodies and individuals, loading them up on ships, and then sending them across the Atlantic Ocean, right? And then in sending them across the Atlantic Ocean, here are slaves, the first slaves arriving into what we now call Brazil as early as 1526, okay? I need to fix this on the slide because this is not quite true. The English did not immediately become slave traders. So if you're writing notes or whatever, I'm going to fix this in the video. It'll be changed in the slides. But the Dutch, the French, the Spanish, they all just kind of naturally followed suit. The Portuguese are doing this thing now. Oh, that makes good sense. We're going to try doing that too. The English are a bit different. So forgive me for putting that there. That is not quite factually correct. But nobody's gonna just willfully enter into slavery, right? So the enslavement of these Africans is always going to be violent. It's always going to be, there's killing, there's burning of villages and homes, destabilizing people, trying to make them homeless, or they don't have shelter and there's nowhere to go. Perhaps that meant that the slave catchers are organizing like raiding parties, where they wait until these villages are all asleep at night and then they go in and invade. And before people can really wake up and see what's going on, it's already kind of over. Right? Now, yes, because they're trying to capture people alive, the goal is not necessarily to kill people, right? But that's an unfortunate consequence of having been here. The other thing is that the slave catchers were very sophisticated. Oftentimes, maybe their methods were trying to launch intertribal warfare between neighboring tribes. And then those tribes try to destabilize each other, and it kind of helps them so that they don't have to exhaust as much work or exhaust as much effort, right? So all of these like intertribal wars or running in and engaging in a raid party to violently capture people, it was all for the sake of putting these people in chains and then shipping them off to the coast where they could be put on boats. Okay. Now, the British are different, uniquely different, right? And this is where the United States of America would ultimately come from, is that the British here, they're relative to Portugal and Spain, they're much, much poorer, right? Because they live on an island that's far north away from the continent of Africa. So where the Portuguese and the Spanish, for example, have almost near immediate access to Africa, even the Greeks have access, or the Egyptians, everybody in this sort of Mediterranean, North African region, they're all wealthy, they're all rich, they're all powerful. The English are just kind of off and away a little bit. So they don't necessarily have the resources and the power that the Portuguese and the Spanish do, for example. But they still wanted to send their own expeditions to colonize whatever, lay claim to whatever land they can go and lay claim to, if you can try to lay claim to something, right? But they were very slow to develop their settlements because the region that they inhabited, I showed you in an image a few slides ago, was along the east coast of what we now call the United States. And there it had harsh weather conditions. You got hurricanes, you got tornadoes, you got blizzards, and they're not necessarily adequately prepared for being able to handle those things in these new environments while trying to chop down wild trees, build new buildings and houses. It makes sense when you think about it that way. The English monarchy was far too poor to just finance the kinds of colonizing expeditions that the Spanish and the Portuguese were doing. But they did, in fact, make the effort to do so. Okay? One of the things that allowed them to get to colonize the eastern part of the United States was because of the Anglo-Spanish War. And that's because Spain, again, think about the size of the country of Spain relative to North, Central, and South America. They spread themselves way too thin. And in spreading themselves way too thin, it meant that the English could perhaps engage in a kind of naval warfare of some kind, and win against the Spanish, which would allow them to acquire resources from the victories of that combat that would then allow them to sustain traveling across the Atlantic Ocean and then trying to lay claim to some land for themselves, right? So the resources that they acquired from the victory of the Anglo-Spanish War essentially allowed them to grant funding to joint stock companies that could then go out and form settlements in whatever lands that they could. There we go. So one of the first permanent British colonies in this new land was actually founded by a company. Believe it or not. So the United States of America, in its ultimate seed planting legacy, was started by a company. All right. It's kind of cosmically poetic in a way when you think about the culture of capitalism here. But they formed a settlement called Jamestown. And the company that did this was the Virginia Company of London. This is ultimately where you get the name of the state Virginia, right? Now, in this case, I am of the impression, I don't quite know for certain, so somebody is welcome to fact check me on this, but my understanding is that Virginia was in reference to like virginity or like purity of femininity, and this is where that term came from. Yeah.
Queen Elizabeth was assumed to be a virgin because she never married, so that's where a lot of that like
Sure.
virginity.
Yeah, sure.
comes from,
Yeah.
in her honor.
Yeah, because it's sort of pious and holy in a way, right? So yeah, this company, the Virginia Company of London, sets out. They set an establishment, and they call it Jamestown. And they don't necessarily know what they're going to try to do to acquire resources and build wealth, but they're looking for something. Okay, but the settlement that they landed in, they ultimately called Jamestown, Virginia. Okay, so this Virginia Company. They were trying to look for gold. They're trying to plant crops. They're trying to perhaps form trade systems with the natives that are there. Maybe they can cut lumber and then ship that lumber back over into England. Maybe they can grow rice or sugar or some kind of crops. But almost none of these like experimental endeavors were successful, particularly when it came to crop growing, and that's because the region of Virginia is just not suitable for growing rice or sugarcane or silk or something like that, right? But there was this plant that the natives were consuming or like smoking called tobacco, right? This new plant that when you smoke it, it gives you unique sensations in the body that might be a nice resource to build some kind of wealth on if you can cultivate this plant and grow it and then distribute it. And all you really need is to learn from the natives how to cultivate that plant, right? So that's what they were trying to do. And it just so happened to be that the cultivation of tobacco is very sensitive. It's very labor intensive. It requires lots of manpower. The settlers that were there began complaining about the fact that if we're going to grow our tobacco empire and ship this tobacco over back to England, we need more people. We can't just do this on our own. We're a small company, less than 20, I believe. Okay? So, because the British settlers are too poor and can't necessarily go to Africa and just buy slaves, they instead just tried inviting African slaves, particularly the African slaves that were displaced by the ongoing slave-catching endeavors. These British settlers went into these regions, these destabilized regions of Africa, and essentially said, hey, there's this new land. We're trying to develop it, and we need help, but we're not going to enslave you. We can save you from enslavement. Would you be willing to join an indenture? What's an indenture? Yeah. No, it's okay. It's okay.
It's almost like a contract where you're supposed to do it for like a certain period of time, and then at the end, like if you fulfill all of the expectations, at least for the white indentured servants. I don't know about the black ones, but
no, that was
you're
the same.
supposed to like be free at the end of it, supposedly.
Yeah. Yeah, so it was the same for the black indentured servants. There were white British settlers that were indentured servants, and then eventually these Africans were invited to become indentured servants too. And the idea was, maybe Africans are just an ideal choice. We can just kind of position it as, we'll free you from enslavement, but you can join in on this contract. After you work for a certain number of years, you're free to go and try to establish your own thing or just to kind of live your life, and that's the way we'll run it. So that was how all of this got started, believe it or not, was just inviting Africans because they couldn't enslave them. Okay, so 32. Only 32. That's how small this endeavor began. 32 Africans, 15 men, 17 women, said yes and joined an indenture and then went to Jamestown, where both white indentured servants and black indentured servants here essentially worked as equals. Now, to some extent, these indentured servants, especially the black ones, were in fact considered to be unfree but they weren't necessarily enslaved. They were worked, and they were worked for years, but it was on the sort of mutual agreement stipulated by the conditions of the contract. Right? Isn't that interesting? Okay, so for a while, these indentured servants were They served the Jamestown officials. Perhaps they were working in fields. They weren't necessarily plantations just yet. They were just kind of working in fields. And these white and black indentured servants kind of worked as equals. Okay? Part of the English custom of the time was that Christians couldn't be enslaved. So one of the incentives for recruiting these Africans was to say, hey, we're not going to enslave you, and we promise we won't enslave you. All you need to do is take up a Christian name. And if you take up a Christian name, according to English custom, you're perfectly protected, right? And so there were lots of indentured servants, black indentured servants, that did in fact work off their indenture. And they earned their freedom. And then they were able to just be free in these new lands and to figure out life on their own. Right? I'm sorry, did I skip too fast? Sorry. Isn't that interesting? Right? In what would ultimately become the United States of America. Okay? I'm going to move on to the next slide. Yes? Okay. Let me start by saying that releasing these African indentured servants kind of created like a pain point for the settlers, because it means that where you need more manpower, you're still trying to build, you're still trying to expand, but then you're constantly releasing from people the labor that you once hired. It just creates a pain point. And what's becoming appealing is that the powerful Spanish people that are next door, the Spanish settlers that are next door, they have all of these slaves. What if we just kind of went next door and just like bought their slaves? Because then we don't have to go to Africa and go round up slaves. We can just like buy their slaves. And then we can honor the indentured servitude contracts of these recruited black people, but then we can just start kind of transitioning into a culture of slavery. It's just appealing. So they go to their Spanish neighbors, and colloquially, their Spanish neighbors are referring to their own enslaved Africans as los negros. Anyone know what los negros means? The blacks, right? In Spanish, that's what that means. Okay, so the British settlers that are kind of co-mingling with these Spanish settlers, they just kind of adopt the name, but they kind of anglicize it. So the name doesn't become negro or los negros, it becomes negro, right? And let me show you a picture. I'll show you something really quick. Right, some of these people who were stolen were Senegalese, for example. Let's see, what's a good picture? Here's a good picture, right? Senegalese people at the time, right? They're black. So the Spanish are just colloquially calling them that. At the time, calling these people los negros, it didn't carry the same kind of connotation or negative connotation that it kind of does today, politically and historically. It was just a way to refer colloquially and kind of short form to the kinds of people they were talking about, and that the British ultimately adopted that name by referring to them as Negroes. And then Negroes became nigger, because that's a short version, right? And then they would just refer to them as the niggers. And during this particular period in time, in which I'm talking, not necessarily the time period of this sign, during this particular time period, the word nigger was just a short form way to refer to that kind of person. It didn't carry this connotation of inferiority or superiority or something like that. But then ultimately nigger becomes nigga. So it goes los negros to Negroes to niggers to nigga, right? And it just kind of evolves in that way, okay? So that's where the origin of that word comes from. But during this particular period in time, because I jump ahead of myself, I like to do that sometimes, the indentured servants, they're working as equals with the indentured whites. They slept together, both sexually and literally. They lived together, they married together, they had families together. There were quote unquote mulatto people that lived together as equals, all as indentured servants. But this idea that you have to honor these contracts and release these people from those contracts just made perhaps purchasing Spanish-owned slaves just a little more appealing. And so ultimately, that's kind of what happens, right? And here I am jumping ahead of myself again, right? I don't really think I need to say anything here. I'm just going to kind of jump over it because I kind of already said that, if that's okay. But the point is that indentured servitude became a pain point, okay? So by the time we get to the 1640s and the 1700s, there's this like conflict going on where if you're black and you're indentured, we know what you're here for. You're here to work. You're here to labor. You're here to contribute to the expansion of Jamestown. But if you're white, maybe you're an indentured servant, but maybe you're a political leader too. And so naturally, these conflicts and from the racial difference just start to kind of fester up. And because there's this desire to get access to slaves, so you don't have to release your indentured servants, that sort of black-white racial difference ultimately started sowing seeds for, we want black slaves, we need more niggers, we can get those niggers from the Spanish, we can enslave them, we don't have to let them go, we can control their reproduction, and then the indentured servants, they're free to go do whatever they want to, and we can just have niggers of our own. Okay. So as Spanish territories are expanding and they're becoming more mature and they're growing their slave population, they're still importing slaves from Africa, but they're also controlling the reproduction of the slaves that they have. Access to African slaves just became cheaper in the Americas. So it started changing the sort of economic and cultural landscape where white indentured servants are like more expensive. They're not even desirable, especially if you can get access to cheap black slaves, right? So now this culture of labor starts to take on a form of racial preference in which the poor whites are now pretty much free to like figure out how they want to build their wealth in this new land. Maybe that means they go and try to get some slaves of their own. Maybe it doesn't. But ultimately, the British would kind of use this access to Spanish-owned slaves to create their own slave economy and to build the wealth for themselves by growing and cultivating tobacco, shipping that tobacco across the seas, increasing the population size of the number of slaves that they have, that they just slowly and kind of exponentially started gaining control over the African slave trade. Because now they have enough manpower to generate enough wealth to get enough boats that they can go to Africa and get some more slaves for their own, right? And then perhaps because they're competing with Spain, competing with Portugal, start trying to use that wealth to undermine their access to slaves so that they can continue to grow their slave economy for themselves. And ultimately, this is how the British kind of exponentially expanded their wealth and eventually gained control of the African slave trade or the transatlantic slave trade. Any questions, curiosities so far? So at the same time that this is going on, by the 1730s, you get numerous scientific scholars that are trying to examine the nature of humanity in a scientifically meaningful sense. What does it mean to be human? Why are there these racial differences? Can we map them out? Can we group them? And Carolus Linnaeus is one of the first people to attempt to try to do this, not just for people, but his interest was in trying to find the relationship between all life on Earth according to appearance. Is anyone familiar with Linnaean taxonomy? Do you know what that is? It's the two-name Latin naming system, so like Homo sapiens, for example, right? You have homo, which means man, and sapiens, which means wise. You put them together and you can describe them in that way. You have other forms of Homo neanderthalensis, Homo ergaster. I don't know, yeah, there's two name systems for lions, right? Panthera leo, right? The point is that Carolus Linnaeus is the one who comes up with this naming system. And so in a scientifically meaningful sense, because he's not just sitting here going, I just want to make black people inferior, he's genuinely trying to classify human beings in a biologically meaningful sense. So he rightly classifies human beings as a kind of primate, but then goes a step too far, because he then starts classifying subgroups of humans as if they are different species. He names Homo americanus, Homo europaeus, Homo asiaticus, and Homo africanus. And he describes them and writes about them in his publication Systema Naturae as if they are different species. And he describes, or at least tries to explore, what lines can be drawn to define why one group is a different species from another. And ultimately what happened was he's using not just appearance, skin color, but he's also using culture, language, clothing, as a way to describe the perhaps sophisticated nature or lack of sophisticated nature of these individuals. And he alludes to this notion that these racial differences between these species, if Africans in their natural environment appear to be barbaric, if Americans in their natural environment appear to be barbaric, they must be in some way, it is in their biological nature to be that way. And if Europe is like more elegant, clearly more technologically sophisticated, then that too must mean that Europeans, it is somehow in their biological nature to be that way. Okay, and so Systema Naturae, this is you can find PDFs of the original writings, you can find translations of these writings. This is a book that you can have access to on the internet, and you can read about what he's saying here. I'm not necessarily saying you need to do that for this class, but this is where he's reading about, and it becomes kind of like, let's say, monumental, groundbreaking, significant on the scientific front. Because now there's these different kinds of humans and there's clearly these different kinds of species. And then other scientists start building on these ideas. And you get to Carolus Linnaeus, who is a German polygenist. He is an outspoken polygenist in contrast and defiantly against the Pope. He's a favorite intellectual ancestor of the Nazis. He was a professor at the University of Göttingen in Germany. And in his publications, he's claiming to have studied the physical, mental, and moral characteristics of each race. And do you know what this man is saying? He says, for example, I disagree with Carolus Linnaeus. I think that instead of describing these different species of man, you really just might be able to just kind of delineate them in two distinct groups. You have the beautiful white race and the ugly black race. And the Americans are a variant of the ugly black race. And that is because the Americans, like the Africans, are barbaric, they're savages, they're animal-like. And the Europeans, by contrast, for example, are elegant and sophisticated and delicate. And so in his writings, for example, he's saying, like, these ugly races here, they're inferior. They're immoral, they're beastly, they're animal-like. And literally in his writings, that is what he's saying. Okay? So his argument on the scientific front, as a professor at a university that still exists today, in his publications, this is what he's saying. And because, the lay people, they don't know how to scrutinize these ideas. They're not scientifically savvy. Their only access to any of this information is what these people are telling them. They kind of soak it up. They absorb it. Right? He says, for example, in one of his writings, I don't expect you to write this down or memorize it or anything. He says, the more intelligent and noble people are by nature, the more adaptable, sensitive, delicate, and soft is their body. On the other hand, the less they possess the capacity and disposition towards virtue, the more they lack adaptability. And not only that, but the less sensitive are their bodies. The more they can tolerate extreme pain or the rapid alteration of heat and cold. When they're exposed to illness, the more rapid their recovery from wounds that would be fatal for more sensitive peoples, and the more they can partake of the worst and most indigestible foods without noticeable ill effects. These words, if you read these words, and this is the only thing you have to go on for shaping your understanding of these people, what do you think that's going to do? Like at the societal level. What's going to happen? What's the consequence of that? Yeah, tell me your name.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Can we get the microphone passed over to Gavin, please? Thank you. What's going to happen?
I feel like it, like over time, will one, like create like a kind of societal norm that like if you're not white, you're barbaric.
Yeah.
And that like I feel like it could also like create a bunch of different. I'm trying to think of the right word. Like I don't know. I think if anything like that is like taught over generations, I think it could also like make you lack a lot of empathy.
Yeah, lack empathy. And if you lack empathy, what are you willing to do?
Yeah, like not much.
So like, for example, you're literally reading, they can tolerate extreme pain.
Yeah.
What might somebody do if they read that and truly believed it?
Yeah.
Can we, sorry.
Within the medical field, there's a persisting idea that Black people and people of color are less sensitive to pain, which, along with other factors, is a reason why it's really common for when people go into hospitals seeking medical care for pain, they're less likely to receive pain medication or treatment at all, or receive like a way lower dose. So like that's just a way that like just this one idea like persists in like modern ideology. Yeah.
But then we're not, you're absolutely correct, but we're not in the modern medical field yet. We're in the era of slavery and brutalization, right? Yeah. So if you're reading that they can tolerate extreme pain, they can tolerate the rapid alteration of heat and cold, what does that create? Yeah.
I was gonna say like they did lots of like torture on slaves and also like really terrible medical experiences.
Yeah.
No anesthesia.
Right. Because if I truly believe the scientific words that are written here and they have credibility because of this person of authority in the scientific field, I can rape you, I can murder you, I can maim you, I can beat you, I can deprive you of clothing and shelter, I can force you to do whatever I want. And I don't even have to feel guilty about it. I don't even lose sleep. I can brutalize you. And it's not like anyone is pointing and saying, well, I read that Christoph Miner said. It's like this knowledge is just circulating, and then it becomes common knowledge. It becomes the thing that people just know. It's a scientific fact. Like Black people have thick skin. They're like animal-like. They don't even really have any animal feeling. You can just kind of do whatever you want to. It justifies their enslavement. It justifies brutalizing them the ways that we historically see. Excuse me, I dropped my pen. Right? So he's writing, for example, he says that the Negro, borrowing from the language of the Spanish, the Negro felt less pain than other races and lacked emotion, had no human or barely animal feeling, was the most unhealthy race on earth because of poor diet, mode of living, and lack of morals. If you read those things and you truly believed it, well, damn. Maybe we can gather up, we can smile, we can have barbecues, we could have a bonfire and not feel guilty about the ways that we treat these individuals. But it wasn't just the niggers. It was the Americans too, right? He claimed, for example, that these Americans, he did not use the language of the first Americans, that's me. He claimed that they could not adapt to different climates. And part of the reason for that is because in their examination of these new people, they took some of these people and put them on a boat to transport them back to Europe, but didn't give them any clothing at all. Imagine being on a wooden boat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean for months at a time with no clothes on. Are you going to survive? No. And I wish I could find it. There's a picture on the internet. I don't know. There's a picture on the internet of one of these natives on a boat completely naked. And it's kind of like that. One of those old black and white 1920s photos. And I wish I could find it. I wish I could. He claimed that they can feed off of any kind of foul offal without illness. What is foul offal? What do you think foul offal is? Yeah, remind me.
Oh, Elodie?
Yeah, pass the mic, please.
Foul oval? I would guess it's just like garbage or something. Like.
That's a good guess. It's like the guts, like the intestines, the liver, the heart, the lungs, moldy food, right? Unfortunately, in like the original soul food culture where the dish like chitlins comes from, you know, it's pork intestines, or like ham hocks. That's what they had. It's like that. He claimed, for example, that, the Americans, they felt less pain than Europeans. Their skin was thicker than an ox. They can tolerate more pain. And then you get this. It wasn't just black people getting lynched, it was these natives too. And not just these two people, but more, right? He claimed that Middle Easterners and Asians, for example, are of limited intelligence and of an evil disposition. And then the Celts, by contrast, are the noblest race because they're selective about their diet, they're able to adapt to different conditions. They conquered several parts of the world. So clearly they are like the apex form of human. Isn't that insane? What time does class end? 20? 25? 20? Okay. Yeah. We'll go ahead and we'll leave it there then, and then when we come back, we'll finish up.